The pre-dawn air in Terminal C of Dallas Love Field Airport hung thick with the metallic tang of recycled air and the low hum of weary travelers. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the bustling scene. Mark Ellison, his jaw tight, navigated the throngs of people with the grim determination of a soldier breaching enemy lines. His flight to Chicago was boarding in 15 minutes, and the morning had already been a symphony of minor disasters. A spilled coffee, a missed exit, and a traffic jam that had left him white-knuckling the steering wheel. Each setback chipped away at his composure, leaving him raw and simmering beneath a veneer of forced calm. Just get to the gate. Just get to the gate. He repeated to himself, the mantra a fragile shield against the rising tide of frustration. He rounded a corner, his gaze fixed on the departure board, and collided with a solid figure. His carry-on bag swung wide, clipping the stranger's arm. "Excuse me, watch where you're going," a calm voice said. The words, though polite, pricked at Mark's already frayed nerves. He stopped abruptly, the irritation bubbling over. "Watch where I'm going? I'm trying to catch a flight, lady, and the entire world seems determined to stop me." He turned, ready to unleash the torrent of frustration building inside him. "You got a problem?" he snapped, the words harsher than he intended. Chief Monique Langston, her expression unreadable, met his gaze. She had been on her way to a security briefing, her mind already dissecting the latest crime statistics, when the collision jolted her back to the present. The man's aggressive posture and the barely contained fury in his eyes were a stark contrast to her own carefully cultivated composure. She registered his tense shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the handle of his carry-on bag, the subtle tick in his jaw. He's a coiled spring. She thought. Ready to snap. She hadn't expected such a hostile reaction to a simple request. She'd dealt with far more volatile situations with far less outward display of emotion. "No problem," she replied evenly, her voice a smooth counterpoint to his agitation. She shifted her weight, intending to step around him, but the movement dislodged her police badge, causing it to partially slip from the inner pocket of her blazer. Mark saw the glint of metal and his mind, already primed for conflict, leaped to a conclusion. She's reaching for something. Panic flared in his chest, tightening his throat. He lashed out, his hand connecting with hers before she could fully withdraw the badge. "She's reaching for something," he shouted, his voice echoing through the terminal. The slap resonated, sharp and loud, in the sudden hush that descended upon the surrounding area. The world seemed to slow down, the murmur of the crowd fading into a low drone as every eye turned towards them. He saw the shock ripple across her face, quickly replaced by a controlled anger that sent a shiver down his spine. The two TSA officers stationed nearby, initially drawn by Mark's raised voice, moved towards them, their hands hovering near their belts. The female supervisor, a woman with fiery red hair pulled back in a tight bun, followed close behind, her expression a mixture of concern and annoyance. The scene unfolded before a silent audience of stunned travelers, many of whom had their phones raised, capturing the incident. Monique took a deep breath, her mind racing. This could escalate quickly. She realized. I need to de-escalate this, now. She slowly withdrew her hand, revealing the badge. "I am Chief Monique Langston, Dallas Police Department," she stated, her voice firm and clear, cutting through the tension. The words hung in the air, heavy with authority. The color drained from Mark's face as the realization of what he had done slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at the badge, then at the woman he had just struck, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the agitated traveler with the authority she now represented. Police chief? Oh God. The blood pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The TSA officers exchanged uneasy glances, their initial posture of support for Mark evaporating as quickly as the morning mist. The supervisor's expression shifted from annoyance to something akin to horrified fascination. She quickly stepped forward. "Chief Langston, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Monique nodded, her gaze still fixed on Mark. I'm fine, she replied, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Underscore disappointment, anger, but above all, a weary resignation. Underscore she had hoped that her position would afford her a certain level of respect, a shield against the casual prejudices she had encountered throughout her career. This incident, however, was a stark reminder that even a badge couldn't always protect her from the assumptions and biases that permeated society. The airport police arrived within minutes, their presence solidifying the reality of Mark's situation. He watched numbly as they approached, their movements crisp and efficient. He felt a hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the scene, away from the murmuring crowd, away from the woman whose career he had potentially jeopardized with a single impulsive act. The airline representative, a man in a navy blazer, appeared as if from nowhere, his expression grim. Mr. Ellison, he said, his voice low and devoid of sympathy. I'm afraid I have to inform you that you are suspended pending an investigation. Your flight has departed. Mark, his mind a whirlwind of regret and disbelief, offered no resistance as they led him away. The clicking of his shoes against the polished floor echoed in the sudden silence of the terminal, each step a stark reminder of the consequences of his unchecked anger and hasty judgment. He glanced back at the crowd, a sea of faces staring back at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, condemnation, and something else he couldn't quite decipher. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a premonition of the long, difficult road that lay ahead. The metallic tang of fear coated Mark's tongue. His hand throbbed, a dull echo of the impact. He could still feel the yielding give of her cheek, the heat radiating from her skin. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged gasp. He tasted regret, bitter and acrid, but beneath it, a stubborn ember of self-justification still flickered. She shouldn't have grabbed me like that. The thought, fragile as a butterfly's wing, beat against the hurricane of his anxiety. Two figures in crisp blue uniforms materialized beside him, their presence a sudden, unwelcome intrusion into his swirling vortex of panic and anger. What's going on here? One of the TSA officers asked, his voice gruff, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Mark felt a surge of desperate relief. Authority, order. Finally, he pointed a trembling finger at Monique, the accusation thick in his voice. This woman's causing trouble, assaulting passengers. Monique straightened, her spine a steel rod against the weight of the gathering stares. The sting on her cheek pulsed in time with the chaotic thump of her heart. Control, Monique, control. She took a slow, measured breath, forcing the anger down into the depths of her being. She knew this feeling, this simmering rage that threatened to erupt. She had learned to master it, to wield it like a weapon, but here, now, it felt different. It was laced with something deeper, something colder, the icy realization of how easily she could be dismissed, reduced to a threat simply because of the color of her skin. I'm Chief Monique Langston, Dallas Police Department. Her voice, though quiet, resonated with an authority that cut through the airport's cacophony. The words hung in the air, heavy and still, as if time itself had paused to listen. She reached into her jacket, her movements precise and deliberate, and withdrew her badge, the silver glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. A silence descended, thick and suffocating. The two TSA officers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces paling beneath the tan of their uniforms. The accusing finger that had been pointed at Monique now trembled with a different kind of energy fear. The murmurs that had rippled through the crowd died down, replaced by a hushed whispering, a collective intake of breath. The airport, a place of constant motion and noise, held its breath. Mark stared at the badge, the silver star shimmering mockingly in his vision. His mind, still reeling from the adrenaline, struggled to process the information. Chief, police chief, the words echoed hollowly in his thoughts, devoid of meaning. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, replacing the anger with a sickening certainty. He had made a mistake. Terrible, irreversible mistake. One of the TSA officers cleared his throat, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. "Ma'am, we didn't," he stammered, his eyes darting between Monique and his colleague. Monique met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I understand," she said, her voice calm, betraying none of the turmoil within. The simple words held a weight of unspoken accusation, a quiet indictment of their hasty judgment. A woman with fiery red hair, her uniform identifying her as an airport supervisor, hurried towards them, her face etched with concern. She spoke briefly to the TSA officers, her gaze flickering towards Monique with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Then, she turned to Mark, her expression hardening. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no words came out. His throat was tight, constricted by the fear that was now a living thing, coiling around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He looked at Monique, her face a mask of composure, and he saw not anger, but a profound disappointment that cut him deeper than any physical blow. 2 airport police officers arrived, their movements swift and efficient. They placed their hands on Mark's arms, the touch firm but impersonal. He offered no resistance, his body numb, his mind a blank slate. He was led away, the whispers of the crowd following him like phantom fingers, brushing against his skin, leaving a trail of shame and regret in their wake. A man in a navy blazer, his face a picture of professional regret, approached him as he sat, handcuffed, in a sterile airport holding room. "Mr. Ellison," he began, his voice low and apologetic, "I'm afraid I have some bad news. Due to the circumstances, the airline has no choice but to suspend you pending a full investigation." Mark stared at the man, the words barely registering. Suspension. Investigation. His career, his life was unraveling before his eyes, all because of a single impulsive act. He closed his eyes, the image of Monique's calm, disappointed face seared onto the back of his eyelids. He had seen her not as a person, but as an obstacle, a nuisance in his path. And in that moment of unchecked aggression, he had destroyed not only his own future, but also the fragile trust that existed between strangers, between individuals who, despite their differences, shared the same space, the same air, the same fragile human experience. The cacophony of the airport terminal pressed in on Mark, a roaring tide of rolling suitcases and chattering voices. The stale air, thick with the scent of cheap coffee and jet fuel, clung to the back of his throat. His hand throbbed, a dull, persistent ache radiating from his palm. He could still feel the jarring impact, the unexpected resistance. He hadn't meant to slap her, but the way she'd grabbed him, the sudden, sharp tug on his arm, it had felt like an attack. His reaction had been pure instinct, a reflex born of a morning already teeming with frustrations. A missed alarm, a spilled coffee, a traffic jam that had stretched on for miles. Now this. He glanced at the woman he'd struck. She stood a few feet away, back ramrod straight, her expression unreadable. A small, dark stain bloomed on her crisp white blouse, a stark contrast against the fabric. He swallowed, a knot tightening in his stomach. He'd been so focused on his flight, on the ticking clock that was his layover, he hadn't even seen her clearly. A flicker of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through his anger. "Sir, please step aside right now." The TSA officer's voice, amplified by his microphone, sliced through the noise. Mark shifted his gaze to the young man in uniform, the badge gleaming on his chest. He felt a surge of resentment. Why was he being singled out? He'd been assaulted. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain the situation, to justify his actions, but the words caught in his throat. He was suddenly aware of the sea of faces surrounding him, the curious stares, the whispers, the phones held aloft, recording the scene. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a specimen pinned under a microscope. "Wait, no. She didn't say she was police." The words tumbled out, a desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of the past few minutes. Had she identified herself? He couldn't recall. The overwhelming stress of the morning, the simmering frustration, had clouded his judgment. He'd acted impulsively, rashly. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He'd made a mistake. Colossal mistake. The TSA officer paused, his gaze flickering between Mark and the woman. A subtle shift in his posture, a slight hesitation in his grip on his radio, spoke volumes. The officer's initial certainty, the instinctive alignment with the aggrieved white male, was wavering. Doubt crept into his eyes, replaced by a dawning comprehension. He saw it now. The way she held herself, the quiet authority that radiated from her despite the chaos. The almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the controlled flicker of her eyelids. This wasn't a hysterical passenger. This was something else entirely. "You should sit down." Her voice, low and steady, cut through the murmuring crowd. "You just made the worst professional decision of your life." Each word was precise, deliberate, like a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of his composure. He stared at her, his mind reeling. The knot in his stomach tightened, twisting into a cold, hard ball of dread. He saw it now, the small gold badge pinned to her blouse, partially obscured by the spreading stain. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, washing over him, drowning him in a sea of regret. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Shame burned in his throat, choking him. He looked at the TSA officer, pleading silently for help, for understanding, but the officer's face was impassive, his eyes cold and distant. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. The airport, once a symbol of escape, of freedom, now felt like a prison, the curious onlookers his jailers. He could feel their judgment, their condemnation, weighing him down, crushing him beneath its weight. Monique watched the man's face crumble, the bravado replaced by a dawning horror. She felt no satisfaction, only a weary disappointment. She'd seen this before, this instinctive aggression, this casual disregard for those deemed other. She straightened her shoulders, resisting the urge to touch her throbbing cheek. The sting of the slap was a physical manifestation of a deeper wound, a wound that went beyond the individual and touched upon the collective trauma of her community. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, to maintain her composure. This wasn't about her. This was about something bigger. This was about accountability. The airport supervisor, a woman with fiery red hair pulled back in a tight bun, arrived at the scene, her face a mask of professional concern. She spoke briefly to the TSA officers, her gaze flitting to Mark with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. She then turned to Monique, her expression softening slightly. A few hushed words were exchanged, and the supervisor nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She gestured to the arriving airport police officers, two uniformed figures who moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Mark watched as they approached, their hands resting on their holsters. He felt a surge of panic, a primal fear gripping his chest. He wanted to run, to disappear, to erase the last few minutes from existence. But he knew it was too late. He was trapped, caught in the web of his own actions. The officers spoke to him, their voices calm but firm. They asked him to accompany them, their hands hovering near his arms, ready to restrain him if necessary. He complied, his legs feeling heavy and leaden, his mind numb with shock. As he was led away, he caught a glimpse of Monique, her face etched with a profound sadness. He averted his gaze, unable to bear the weight of her disappointment, the silent condemnation in her eyes. He had lost everything, his career, his reputation, his dignity, all because of a single, impulsive act. An airline representative, a man in a crisp navy blazer, approached him as he sat handcuffed in a small, sterile room. He informed Mark of his suspension, his voice devoid of emotion. The words echoed in the small room, a final confirmation of his downfall. He closed his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had flown thousands of miles, navigated complex flight paths, faced countless challenges in the air. But he had failed to navigate the complexities of human interaction, the treacherous terrain of his own biases. He had crashed, not in a plane, but in the crowded terminal of an airport, his life shattered into a million pieces. The insistent, shrill chirping clawed its way into Mark's sleep, a discordant symphony that grated against the quiet hum of the air conditioner. His hand, heavy with sleep, fumbled for the snooze button, connecting with the smooth, cool surface of the nightstand instead. He groaned, the sound muffled by the pillow. A sliver of awareness pierced the fog in his brain. Late. He was late. The digital clock on the nightstand glared at him, a malevolent red eye in the pre-dawn gloom. 6:15 a.m. 15 precious minutes, stolen by the treacherous silence of a dead phone battery. His gut clenched, a knot of anxiety tightening with each passing second. The carefully constructed schedule he'd built around this flight, the meticulously planned connections, all crumbling under the weight of those lost minutes. He scrambled out of bed, the crisp hotel sheets clinging to his skin, a physical reminder of the comfortable rest he'd been cheated out of. The shower was a hurried, perfunctory affair, the hot water doing little to soothe the rising tide of frustration. He could practically feel the minutes ticking away, each one a small, sharp stab of annoyance. As he dressed, pulling on the crisp white shirt and navy trousers that were the uniform of his profession, his mind raced, calculating, strategizing. He could still make it. He had to. This flight was crucial, the linchpin in a series of complex logistical arrangements that couldn't afford to be disrupted. The Uber arrived 15 minutes later than the app had promised. The driver apologetic but unhelpful. Traffic, he'd explained. A shrug of his shoulders conveying the universal helplessness in the face of gridlock. Mark sat in the back, the leather seat sticking uncomfortably to his skin, the hum of the air conditioning a poor substitute for the cool, calm air of the cockpit. He watched the city crawl by outside the window, a blur of concrete and steel, each stalled car a testament to his dwindling chances. His fingers drummed against the armrest, a restless rhythm that echoed the frantic beat of his heart. He fought the urge to urge the driver on, knowing it was futile. The city held them captive, a web of congested streets and impatient drivers. The airport was a cacophony of noise and movement, a swirling vortex of hurried travelers and stressed-out families. The air hung thick with the smell of stale coffee and jet fuel, a scent that usually filled Mark with a sense of anticipation, now only fueled his anxiety. He navigated the crowded terminal, his carry-on bag bumping against his leg, each jostle a spark of irritation. He could feel the pressure mounting, a tight band around his chest, constricting his breath. The gate number, flashing on the departure board, seemed to mock him, a distant beacon of hope receding with every agonizing step. The line at security snaked through the terminal, a seemingly endless queue of impatient passengers. The low hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional wail of a child, grated on his already frayed nerves. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, the hard tile floor unforgiving beneath the thin soles of his shoes. He checked his watch obsessively, the ticking seconds a countdown to failure. Each minute that passed felt like an hour, each delay an insurmountable obstacle. The knot in his stomach tightened, a physical manifestation of his mounting frustration. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the front of the line. He fumbled with his boarding pass and ID, his hands trembling slightly, a betrayal of the tight control he was struggling to maintain. The TSA officer, a young woman with a tired expression, scanned his documents with practiced indifference. He moved through the metal detector, the cold metal against his skin a jarring contrast to the rising heat of his anger. He collected his belongings, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, the carefully cultivated composure he usually maintained in public beginning to crack. He made it to the gate just as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. He approached the desk, his boarding pass clutched in his hand, a small, flimsy piece of paper that represented his last chance. The gate agent, a young man with a carefully neutral expression, scanned his pass. "I'm sorry, sir," the agent said. his voice devoid of any real sympathy. The flight is closed. The words hit Mark like a physical blow. All that rushing, all that stress, for nothing. The carefully constructed edifice of his composure crumbled. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over him, hot and suffocating. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching himself from a distance, a spectator to his own unraveling. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He could only stare at the gate agent, his vision blurring, the world around him fading into a hazy, indistinct background. The hum of the terminal, the chatter of the passengers, all seemed to recede, replaced by a roaring silence in his ears. He was a tightly wound spring, stretched to its breaking point, and he knew with a chilling certainty that something was about to snap. The sterile fluorescence of the airport terminal buzzed, a stark counterpoint to the chaotic scene unfolding. Mark Ellison, his face a mask of disbelief, felt the cold steel of handcuffs clamp around his wrists. Just moments ago, his anger, hot and visceral, had propelled him. Now, a chilling wave of realization washed over him, each clink of the metal a hammer blow against his crumbling composure. Chief of Police? The words echoed in his mind, a dissonant clang against the roaring in his ears. He'd struck the Chief of Police? His gut clenched, a cold knot of dread tightening with each passing second. He struggled to reconcile the poised, commanding woman before him with the image of the jostling, careless traveler he'd perceived just moments ago. How could he have been so wrong? So utterly, catastrophically wrong? Monique Langston stood amidst the swirling vortex of activity, her expression unreadable. The sting of the slap still throbbed on her cheek, a dull ache mirroring the deeper wound to her pride. Years of training, years spent cultivating an impenetrable facade, threatened to crack under the weight of the blatant disrespect. She drew a slow, steadying breath, focusing on the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, a practiced exercise in control. The airport, once a symbol of transition and possibility, now felt like a suffocating cage. The curious stares of the onlookers, the hushed whispers, the incessant clicks of phone cameras, they all pressed in on her. A tangible manifestation of the humiliation. Control, Monique, control. She repeated the mantra silently, willing her emotions back into their carefully constructed box. This wasn't just about her. It was about the badge, the uniform, the authority she represented. The two TSA officers, their initial bravado replaced by a nervous shuffling of feet, avoided Monique's gaze. The veneer of authority they had wielded so confidently just moments ago had dissolved, leaving them exposed and uncertain. The female supervisor, her red hair a fiery beacon in the sea of bland uniforms, efficiently directed the arriving airport police officers. Her voice, crisp and professional, cut through the ambient noise, restoring a semblance of order to the chaotic scene. Assault. Pilot struck a passenger who turned out to be the chief of police. The words, stark and unambiguous, hung in the air, a damning indictment. Mark watched, numb, as the officers led him away, the murmurs of the crowd a buzzing backdrop to his inner turmoil. His career, his reputation, his life, everything he had worked for was unraveling before his eyes, thread by thread. He had allowed a fleeting moment of anger, a surge of unchecked frustration, to dictate his actions. And now he was paying the price. A heavy weight settled in his chest, a suffocating blend of regret and fear. He hadn't even reached his gate. His carefully planned trip, his meticulously packed suitcase, his anticipated destination all seemed distant and irrelevant now, lost in the swirling fog of his rapidly disintegrating reality. Monique accepted the proffered tissues from a sympathetic bystander, dabbing at the lingering warmth on her cheek. She felt a strange disconnect from the scene, as if observing it from a distance. The offers of support, the expressions of outrage from the surrounding passengers, felt strangely muted, filtered through a layer of emotional detachment. A young woman, her eyes wide with indignation, stepped forward. "I saw everything, officer. I can give a statement. He just slapped you." Another voice chimed in, a man in a business suit, his face flushed with anger. I recorded the whole thing on my phone. It was unprovoked. Completely unprovoked. The airport supervisor, her expression a mixture of concern and professional detachment, addressed Monique. Chief Langston, are you all right? Do you require medical attention? Monique shook her head, a slight tremor betraying the inner turmoil she fought to contain. I'm fine. Thank you. Her voice was steady, even betraying none of the emotional turbulence churning within. She knew she had to maintain her composure, not just for herself, but for the uniform she wore, the city she represented. As Mark was escorted away, a man in a navy blazer approached Monique. He introduced himself as an airline representative. His voice, smooth and practiced, held a note of barely concealed disapproval. Chief Langston, I understand Captain Ellison is one of our pilots. I assure you we take this matter very seriously. He has been immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Monique nodded, acknowledging his words without comment. The airline representative's words were a small, but necessary validation. A confirmation that the world, despite its inherent imperfections, still held a semblance of justice. The crowd began to disperse, the ripple of shockwaves gradually subsiding. The airport terminal, once a stage for a dramatic confrontation, slowly returned to its usual hum of activity. Monique stood for a moment, gathering herself, the weight of the incident settling upon her like a heavy cloak. The buzzing fluorescence seemed to intensify, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and contorted around her. She closed her eyes, drawing another deep breath, the sterile air filling her lungs. The security briefing, the reason for her presence in this chaotic hub, now seemed a distant, almost insignificant detail. She had a city to protect, a department to lead, and she wouldn't let a single act of aggression, however shocking, derail her from that purpose. The sting on her cheek was a reminder, a stark and unwelcome lesson in the persistent undercurrents of prejudice that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. But it was also a catalyst, a reaffirmation of her resolve. She would rise above this. She had to, not just for herself, but for everyone who looked to her, who relied on her, who believed in the power of justice and the enduring strength of resilience. The sterile fluorescence of the conference room hummed, a low, persistent thrum that mirrored the dull ache behind Monique's eyes. 7:15 a.m. The air, conditioned to a crisp chill, carried the faint metallic tang of airport recycled air and the ghost of stale coffee. Around the oval table, faces a mosaic of uniforms and suits blurred into an indistinct mass. She registered the drone of the security chief's voice, a litany of protocols and threat assessments, but the words seemed to skim the surface of her consciousness, failing to penetrate the tight coil of tension in her chest. Her fingers, laced together atop the table, felt stiff, almost numb. Beneath the impeccably tailored navy suit, the phantom sting on her cheek pulsed in time with the thrumming lights. Focus, Monique, she chided herself, her internal voice a low, steady murmur against the rising tide of anger. This is important. But the image of the man's contorted face, the sheer force of his hand against her skin, kept intruding, a vivid, unwelcome replay. Captain Mark Ellison. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She had spent years meticulously constructing a shield, a professional armor designed to deflect the casual slights, the subtle dismissals, the insidious whispers that came with being a black woman in a world built for others. Years spent honing her composure, her ability to compartmentalize, to rise above. But this raw, visceral act of violence had chipped away at the carefully constructed facade, exposing the raw vulnerability beneath. It wasn't just the physical assault, it was the casual assumption of her guilt, the immediate bias of the TSA agents, their instinctive siding with the irate white man against the calm, composed black woman. The memory of their hesitant apologies, the belated recognition dawning in their eyes when she'd finally revealed her badge, only added another layer to the complex cocktail of emotions swirling within her. Shame not for herself, but for the system that perpetuated such ingrained prejudices. Disappointment not in the individuals, but in the pervasive reality of the situation. She'd faced this before in different guises. The condescending tone of a senior officer early in her career, dismissing her insights as overly emotional. The skeptical glances from colleagues when she'd been promoted, the unspoken question of whether she'd earned it or simply been a diversity hire. Each incident, a tiny pinprick, a slow erosion of her faith in the very institution she'd sworn to serve. She'd learned to swallow the bitterness, to channel the anger into quiet, persistent action, to prove them wrong, not with words, but with results. But this time felt different. This time, the violation was more profound, the sting more acute. The security chief's voice faded into the background, replaced by the insistent hum of the lights, the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the table, the shallow rasp of someone's breath. She focused on the minutiae, on the texture of the polished wood beneath her fingertips, the faint floral scent of someone's perfume, the precise angles of the framed security protocols adorning the walls. Anything to anchor herself, to quell the turbulent emotions threatening to spill over. The weight of her badge, nestled against her ribs, was a tangible reminder of her responsibility, of the burden she carried, not just as a police chief, but as a black woman navigating a world fraught with hidden dangers. A question from across the table jolted her back to the present. The airport director, his brow furrowed with concern, was addressing her directly. His voice laced with a cautious deference that hadn't been present in the hurried exchange at the gate. He inquired about her well-being, his eyes lingering on the faint redness still visible on her cheek. The room fell silent, every gaze fixed on her. In that moment, a decision crystallized, sharp and clear as a shard of glass. She could minimize it, brush it off as a minor incident, maintain the carefully constructed facade of professional detachment. She could protect herself from the inevitable scrutiny, the whispers, the second-guessing. Or she could speak her truth, expose the ugliness, and force them to confront the uncomfortable reality. A slow, controlled breath filled her lungs. The tight coil in her chest eased, replaced by a quiet resolve. "I appreciate your concern," she began, her voice steady, even. Her gaze swept across the faces around the table, meeting each one with a calm, unwavering intensity. "Before we continue with the briefing, there's something I need to share." The air in the room thickened, charged with anticipation. In the silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify, a steady, persistent drone that underscored the gravity of the moment. She began to recount the events of the morning, her voice measured and precise, devoid of emotion. But beneath the calm exterior, a different kind of fire burned, a slow, steady blaze that would illuminate the hidden corners, expose the shadows, and force a reckoning. The slap, the casual bias, the swift reversal of fortune when her identity was revealed. Each detail, a brushstroke in a stark portrait of implicit bias and unchecked aggression. And as she spoke, the faces around the table shifted, reflecting a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, shame, and a dawning recognition of the deep, systemic issues that lay beneath the surface of a seemingly minor incident in a crowded airport terminal. The silence that followed her words was heavy, pregnant with unspoken questions. The briefing, forgotten, hung suspended in the air, overshadowed by the weight of her truth. The sterile scent of disinfectant mingled with the faint aroma of stale coffee hung in the air, a familiar airport cocktail. Monique Langston stood at the podium, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off her polished badge. The room was filled with a sea of faces, a mixture of uniforms and suits, all turned towards her, expectant. Her fingers traced the cool metal of the podium, a small, grounding gesture in the storm of her thoughts. "Just breathe, Monique. This is what you do." The echoes of the morning's incident still reverberated within her, a discordant hum beneath the surface of her professional composure. The sting on her cheek, the incredulous stares of the onlookers, the sheer absurdity of it all. She had replayed the scene countless times in her head during the drive here, each repetition adding a new layer of weary disappointment. A crowded airport, a minor bump, a slap. It was a sequence so unbelievable, so deeply rooted in the mire of prejudice, that it felt plucked from a poorly written play. She cleared her throat, the subtle sound amplifying through the room's speakers, silencing the low murmur of conversations. "Good morning, everyone. Before I begin the scheduled briefing, I want to tell you about something that happened to me this morning." Her voice was even controlled, each word meticulously chosen. Inside, however, a whirlwind of emotions churned: anger, frustration, a profound weariness. She forced it all down, focusing on the task at hand. These people needed to hear this. They needed to understand. "I was on my way to this very briefing," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, making brief, pointed contact with individuals in the audience. Navigating the usual airport chaos: delayed flights, long lines, the general air of stressed impatience that permeates these places. A flicker of a bitter smile touched her lips. She remembered the man's face, contorted with rage. His hand raised the searing sting. She pushed the memory away, refusing to give it more power.
Focus, Monique.
Focus on the message. "I accidentally bumped into a man," she stated, the words hanging heavy in the air. She could almost feel the collective intake of breath in the room. A minor collision, the kind that happens a dozen times a day in a crowded terminal. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting it sink in. He reacted poorly. The understatement was deliberate, a stark contrast to the violence of the act. She saw a few heads nod, some exchanging uneasy glances. She knew what they were thinking. Another airport altercation. Nothing new. But this wasn't just another altercation. This was a symptom of a deeper malaise. "He slapped me," she said, the words cutting through the room like a shard of glass. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning. She saw shock, disbelief, even a flicker of denial in some eyes. "Good. Let them feel uncomfortable. He accused me of stealing his wallet," he shouted. He cursed. The memories resurfaced, vivid and raw. The man's spittle flying as he screamed. The fear that, for a fleeting moment, had gripped her. The humiliation. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. 2 TSA officers immediately intervened. They, of course, assumed I was the perpetrator. The bitterness in her voice was subtle, yet unmistakable. They were ready to detain me, to question me, to treat me like a criminal. She paused again, letting the weight of that statement settle upon the audience. "Until I showed them my badge." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. The atmosphere shifted, charged with a palpable tension. Monique could feel their gazes, heavy with a mixture of guilt, embarrassment, and a dawning understanding. She met their eyes, one by one, her own gaze unwavering. "The man," she continued, her voice regaining its steady cadence, "was a pilot. He was late for his flight, stressed. He saw a black woman in a crowded airport and immediately jumped to a conclusion. A dangerous, harmful conclusion based on nothing but the color of my skin." She saw recognition flicker in some eyes, a dawning comprehension of the deeper implications of her story. "He lost his flight," she added, a flicker of grim satisfaction crossing her features. "He lost his job. He's facing charges. And she paused, her voice softening. "I am here, talking to you." She stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the edge of the stage, bridging the distance between herself and the audience. "We talk a lot about security protocols, about threat assessment, about vigilance," she said, her voice low and resonant. "But what good is it if we're only trained to see danger in certain shapes, skin tones, or hairstyles? What good is our training if it blinds us to the real threats, the ones that don't fit neatly into our preconceived notions?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She looked out at the sea of faces, searching for understanding, for a spark of change. "This isn't just about me," she continued, her voice rising in intensity. "This is about every person who has been unfairly targeted, judged, and condemned based on assumptions and biases. This is about the cracks in our system, the blind spots that allow prejudice to flourish." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken thoughts, with the weight of her message. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, then grew stronger, joined by another pair, and another, until the room filled with a muted, almost reverent applause. It wasn't the thunderous ovation of a celebratory event. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was the sound of acknowledgement, of understanding, of a collective commitment to change. Monique stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights, a flicker of hope kindling in her heart. The fight was far from over, but this, she knew, was a start. The stale, recycled air of the airline operations office pressed down on Mark like a physical weight. Fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, the sterile glow reflecting off the cheap laminate furniture. Each tick of the wall clock was a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of his composure. He sat hunched in a hard plastic chair, his tie loosened, his shirt clinging uncomfortably to his damp back. The events of the morning played on an endless loop in his mind, each replay amplifying the humiliation, the disbelief, the gnawing fear that had settled in his gut. He hadn't even had a chance to call his wife, Sarah. The phone had been confiscated along with his badge, his pilot's license, his dignity. He could almost feel the weight of her disappointment, the unspoken question hanging in the air, "What have you done now, Mark?" His fingers traced the outline of the faint bruise blooming on his knuckles. It was a physical manifestation of the anger that had gripped him, an anger that now seemed utterly alien, a phantom limb of a self he no longer recognized. He'd been so sure, so righteous in his fury. The jostle, the perceived slight, the flash of red that had consumed his vision. Now all that remained was a hollow echo of that rage, replaced by a chilling emptiness. He'd reacted instinctively, driven by the accumulated stress of delayed flights, missed connections, and a gnawing sense of powerlessness. He'd seen red, and in that moment all rational thought had evaporated. He hadn't seen a police chief, a woman in authority. He'd seen an obstacle, a symbol of the frustrations that had plagued him all morning. The door opened, admitting a man in a crisp navy blazer. The airline representative. Mark recognized him from the brief, impersonal interactions during training sessions. The man's face was carefully neutral, but Mark could detect a flicker of something cold, almost disdainful, in his eyes. He held a thin manila folder, its contents undoubtedly containing the details of Mark's impending doom. He didn't offer a seat, didn't extend the usual corporate pleasantries. Instead, he stood stiffly, the folder clutched in his hand like a shield. "Captain Ellison," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Due to the incident at the airport this morning, the airline has placed you on emergency leave, pending a full investigation." Each word was enunciated with precise, clipped clarity, each syllable a nail hammered into the coffin of Mark's career. Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Emergency leave. The euphemism hung heavy in the air, a thinly veiled precursor to termination. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the rising tide of despair. What could he say? That he'd misread the situation? That he hadn't known? Ignorance, he knew, was no defense, especially not in the court of public opinion. The representative continued, his voice a monotone drone. "The video of the incident has circulated." He didn't elaborate, but Mark didn't need him to. He could picture it, the grainy footage captured on countless smartphones, replayed ad nauseum on news channels and social media. He could see the shock on the faces of the onlookers, the disgust, the condemnation. He could hear the whispers, the accusations, the pronouncements of guilt. He had become a spectacle, a symbol of everything wrong with the world. The man in the blazer handed him a document, the crisp white paper seeming to burn his fingers. "This outlines the terms of your suspension. You'll need to contact your union representative." The words were perfunctory, devoid of any genuine concern. The representative didn't meet his eye, his gaze fixed somewhere over Mark's shoulder, as if the mere act of looking at him was somehow contaminating. Mark took the document, his fingers numb, his mind reeling. He barely registered the man's departure, the quiet click of the door closing behind him. He sat alone in the sterile room, the silence punctuated only by the relentless hum of the fluorescent lights. He looked down at the document in his hands, the legalese blurring into a meaningless jumble of words. He didn't need to read it. He already knew the verdict. He was guilty not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the world. The weight of his actions, the consequences of his impulsive rage, pressed down on him with crushing force. He thought of Sarah, of the life they had built together, the future they had planned. He had jeopardized it all in a single, fleeting moment of uncontrolled anger. The image of Monique Langston's face, calm and composed even in the face of his aggression, flashed in his mind. The quiet dignity she had exuded, the controlled fury in her eyes. He had seen her badge, the glint of metal against her dark jacket, but it hadn't registered, not until it was too late. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just assaulted a woman, he had assaulted a symbol of authority, a representative of the very law he was now subject to. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of his regret. He was trapped, not just in this sterile office, but in the prison of his own making. He closed his eyes, willing himself to disappear, to erase the events of the morning, to rewind time and undo the damage he had wrought. But the past was immutable, the consequences inescapable. He was adrift, lost in a sea of uncertainty, the wreckage of his life strewn around him. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, morphing into a deafening roar, a symphony of his despair. The fluorescent lights of the gray conference room hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of the airport terminal still echoing in Mark's ears. The sterile air, conditioned to a chilling degree, seemed to suck the very warmth from his body, mirroring the icy dread that coiled in his gut. He sat stiffly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, the cheap material clinging unpleasantly to his trousers. His hands, usually steady on the yoke of a plane, trembled slightly as he picked at a loose thread on his uniform sleeve. He'd flown thousands of hours, navigated complex weather patterns, handled emergency landings with unnerving calm. Yet, here he was, grounded, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, the control he so craved slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Across the polished table, two figures sat like ominous gatekeepers. Ms. Henderson from HR, her face a mask of professional neutrality, her pen poised like a weapon above her notepad. And Mr. Davies from Risk Management, his gaze sharp and assessing, his silence more damning than any accusation. The room was small, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Mark could practically taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. He'd replayed the incident 100 times in his head since the airport police escorted him away from the gate. The jostle, the spilled coffee, her hand on his arm, the flash of anger, the slap. Each replay only served to amplify the throbbing humiliation that pulsed beneath his skin. He'd reacted instinctively, driven by the simmering frustration that had been building all morning: the delayed flight, the lost luggage, the missed connection. He'd seen red, and now, bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of this conference room, he saw the wreckage of his career spread out before him. "Captain Ellison," Ms. Henderson began, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. He flinched inwardly at the formality, the unspoken distance it created. "We've reviewed the security footage, spoken to witnesses, and well, the situation is quite serious." He knew it was serious. He knew the moment he saw her badge, the moment the realization of who she was slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. A police chief. He'd slapped a police chief. In public. In an airport. Surrounded by witnesses with smartphones. The thought made his stomach churn. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt tight. "To understand," he stammered, the words feeling inadequate, hollow. Mr. Davies leaned forward, his voice low and grave. "You assaulted someone in uniform, Captain. In an airport. The fact that CSA police chief puts us in a legal firestorm." A firestorm. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. He'd envisioned this meeting, rehearsed his apologies, crafted a narrative of accidental contact, a misunderstanding. But facing the grim reality of the situation, the words withered on his tongue, choked by the knot of shame that tightened in his chest. It was a mistake, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. He hated the weakness in his tone, the desperation that clung to each syllable. Miss Henderson's pen tapped against her notepad, the sound amplified in the silence. "Captain Ellison," she said, her voice laced with a hint of steel. "What were you reacting to, exactly?" He hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't tell them the truth. He couldn't admit that he'd reacted to her perceived aggression, her tone. He'd seen it in her eyes, he'd felt it in her touch, a challenge, a disrespect. He'd felt threatened. "Her tone," he finally mumbled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Even as he spoke them, he knew how flimsy they sounded, how utterly unconvincing. Mr. Davies raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Her tone." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes, her tone. It was aggressive. She grabbed my arm." He knew he was grasping at straws, but he couldn't bring himself to articulate the unspoken biases that had fueled his reaction, the assumptions he'd made based on her appearance, her race, her gender. The silence in the room stretched, heavy with unspoken judgment. He could feel their gazes boring into him, dissecting his every word, his every gesture. He longed to disappear, to evaporate into the stale air of the conference room. "Captain Ellison," Miss Henderson said slowly, her voice carefully neutral, "multiple witnesses, including 2 TSA agents, have stated that you were the aggressor, that you raised your voice, that you used inappropriate language." Heat flooded his cheeks, shame burning through him like wildfire. He remembered the words he'd spat at her, fueled by his frustration and his misplaced sense of entitlement. Words he couldn't take back, words that now hung in the air like a toxic cloud, suffocating him with their weight. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some semblance of a defense, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he'd lost control? That he'd allowed his anger to override his reason? That he'd acted on impulse, driven by a prejudice he barely acknowledged, a prejudice he'd always denied existed within him? Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "Captain Ellison, pending a full investigation, you are suspended from all flight duties, effective immediately." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Suspended. The word echoed in his ears, a death knell to his career, his passion, his identity. He'd dedicated his life to flying, to the freedom and control it afforded him. And now, in a single, impulsive act, he'd thrown it all away. He looked at Miss Henderson, at Mr. Davies, their faces impassive, their expressions unreadable. He saw not just the representatives of his employer, but the embodiment of a system that held him accountable, a system he'd unwittingly challenged, a system he'd now become a victim of. He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but the words were trapped in his throat, choked by the bitter taste of regret. He'd judged her, misjudged her, and in doing so he'd ultimately judged himself. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, a constant, unwavering reminder of his downfall. The cold, gray walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with the weight of his actions, the consequences of his unchecked rage. The fluorescent lights of the briefing room hummed, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of the airport terminal echoing in Monique's memory. The sterile white walls, the polished table, the neatly arranged chairs all felt miles away from the raw, visceral experience of the past few hours. A faint, metallic tang lingered in the air, a ghost of the fear that had coiled in her stomach when she felt the sting of that slap. She rubbed her cheek almost unconsciously, the phantom sensation a stark reminder of the incident. The image of the man, his face contorted with rage, was burned into her mind. Captain Ellison. The name, like the incident itself, felt heavy, a lead weight settling in the pit of her stomach. Her assistant, A young woman named Sarah with perpetually worried eyes placed a tablet on the table. The screen glowed, displaying a cascade of headlines, each one a variation on the same theme. Dallas police chief assaulted at airport. Pilot slaps police chief. Viral video shows airport altercation. Monique felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The constant barrage of information, the public's insatiable hunger for details, the inevitable dissection of every word and action, it was draining. She had dealt with media scrutiny before, but this felt different. More personal, more invasive. A knot tightened in her chest. It wasn't just the physical assault. It was the humiliation, the feeling of being stripped bare and exposed under the unforgiving gaze of countless strangers. The videos, she knew, were circulating everywhere. Each replay a fresh wound, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She closed her eyes briefly, willing the images to fade, willing the buzzing in her ears to subside. A deep breath, slow and deliberate, helped to steady her. Sarah cleared her throat. Chief, there are several media outlets requesting statements. CNN, Fox News, the local channels. Her voice trailed off, sensing Monique's hesitation. Monique shook her head, the motion small but resolute. No further statements. The initial press release is sufficient. Her voice was calm, even, betraying none of the turmoil churning within. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself, to explain her side of the story, to counter the inevitable narratives that would be spun. But experience had taught her the futility of engaging in a public battle of words. The media, like a hungry beast, would devour any morsel she offered, twisting and distorting it to fit their predetermined narratives. Silence, she knew, was often the most powerful weapon. She picked up the tablet, her fingers hovering over the screen. The headlines blurred, a sea of words assaulting her senses. She saw her name, his name, the word assault, flashing like a warning sign. A sudden wave of nausea rose in her throat. She set the tablet down, the cool glass a welcome contrast to the heat building in her face. Sarah, ever perceptive, offered a quiet, "Are you all right, Chief?" Monique managed a tight smile. "Just tired, Sarah." "Thank you." The words felt heavy, laden with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was a weariness of the soul, a weariness born of the constant struggle against prejudice and misjudgment. A notification pinged on the tablet. Sarah picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the message. "Chief, the airline has issued a press release." Monique braced herself, her stomach clenching. She knew this was coming. The airline's response would be crucial, a barometer of how the incident would be perceived, how her career, her reputation would be impacted. Sarah read aloud, her voice carefully neutral. "Following an unfortunate incident involving one of our pilots, Captain Mark Ellison, we have initiated an internal investigation. We take these matters very seriously and are cooperating fully with local authorities. Captain Ellison has been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation." The words hung in the air, sterile and carefully crafted. Unfortunate incident. The phrase grated on Monique's nerves. It was a sanitized, almost clinical description of a violent act. An attempt to distance the airline from the actions of its employee, to minimize the damage, to protect its brand. She closed her eyes again, the image of Ellison's contorted face flashing behind her eyelids. The casual dismissal, the implicit bias that had fueled his rage, it was all there, embedded in the carefully chosen words of the press release. They had suspended him, yes, but the underlying message was clear. This was an isolated incident, an unfortunate mishap, nothing more. A bitter taste filled her mouth. She knew this was just the beginning. The legal battles, the media circus, the endless scrutiny, it would all take its toll. But she also knew she couldn't afford to crumble. She was the chief of police, a symbol of law and order. She had a responsibility to her city, to her officers, to herself. She had to rise above the noise, above the pain, above the injustice. She opened her eyes, her gaze settling on the city skyline visible through the briefing room window. The skyscrapers stood tall, their steel and glass reflecting the late afternoon sun. They were a symbol of resilience, of strength, of the unwavering spirit of a city that had weathered countless storms. And in that moment, Monique found a flicker of resolve. She would weather this storm too. She would stand tall just like those skyscrapers. She would not be broken. She would not be silenced. She would not be defined by this incident. She would define it. The insistent ringing sliced through the fog of Mark's sleep. His head throbbed, each pulse a cruel reminder of the previous day's disaster. He fumbled for his phone, squinting at the unfamiliar number. "Hello." His voice was rough, sleep-laden. "Captain Ellison? This is Chief Langston." The name was a jolt, a splash of icy water on his drowsy mind. He sat up, the hotel comforter sliding off his chest. Langston, the woman he slapped. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over him. "She's calling to finish me off, to press charges. My career, my life, it's over." His stomach churned. "Chief, he couldn't finish the sentence. The words were tangled in the thorns of guilt and fear. "I'm calling because I was asked to mediate an internal discussion between the city and your airline." Her voice was calm, steady, almost detached. It unnerved him more than any outburst of anger would have. He imagined her, perfectly composed, dissecting his actions, her eyes like chips of obsidian. "She's enjoying this, watching me squirm." He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Mediate?" he croaked, the word barely audible. "Yes, they want to know how far I want to take this." A short pause hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Mark swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat constricting his breath. This is it, he thought, the final blow. "Chief, I can explain," he started, desperation clawing at him. "You can explain to the Board of Inquiry," she interrupted, her voice still level. "And to the judge, should it come to that." He closed his eyes, picturing the sterile courtroom, the judging eyes, the headlines screaming his shame. He saw his wife's face, etched with disappointment, and his daughter's, clouded with confusion. "But," he began, his voice trembling, "she's going to ruin me." The thought pulsed in his head, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "I'm not letting it slide either," she continued, her tone unwavering. A strange mix of relief and dread flooded him. Relief that she wasn't pressing charges immediately. Dread that the axe was still hanging over his head. "Your behavior was unacceptable. Assaulting a police officer, regardless of the circumstances, it has consequences." Mark could hear the distant hum of traffic through the phone, the sounds of a world moving on, a world he was about to be ejected from. He pictured himself adrift, jobless, disgraced, a pariah. He saw his dreams crashing down around him, the shards of his carefully constructed life piercing his heart. Then Langston spoke again, her voice shifting subtly, a hint of something softer entering its steel-like timbre. "You're not going to lose your job today, Captain Ellison." He stared at the phone, dumbfounded. His thoughts, which moments ago had been a chaotic whirlwind, now stilled, suspended in disbelief. "She's not going to ruin me? But," she continued, and his heart lurched again, "I want you to understand why you should apologize. Not just the words, Captain, the meaning behind them." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy with judgment. It was expectant, waiting. Mark struggled to process her words. He expected fury, retribution, not this. This strange blend of firmness and understanding? What is she playing at? He wondered, suspicion warring with a budding flicker of hope. He thought back to the airport, the chaotic scene, the red haze of his own anger. He remembered the look in her eyes after he struck her. Not anger, but a profound sadness. Sadness? The thought echoed in his mind, unsettling him. Had he really been so blinded by his own frustration that he hadn't seen anything beyond his own immediate needs? "Chief," he started, his voice now quieter, less frantic. I was wrong. I let my anger get the better of me." He hesitated, searching for the right words. The words that weren't just a formality, but a genuine expression of remorse. "I misjudged you. I acted like a fool." The words felt inadequate, hollow, but they were a start. I understand you were under stress, Captain, Langston replied, her voice finally losing its edge. But stress is no excuse for violence, especially against someone who was trying to help. Mark winced. Help. She had been trying to help. He'd seen her hand reaching for his, misinterpreted it as a threat. The weight of his misjudgment pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. I know, he whispered, his voice thick with shame. He knew, and that knowledge was more punishing than any legal consequence could ever be. I need to apologize to you in person, properly. There was a pause. Then Langston said, we can discuss that later. For now, I expect you to cooperate fully with the airline's internal review. And Captain Ellison. Yes, Chief. Think about what I said. Think about why you owe me and yourself an apology. The line went dead. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still clutched in his hand. The rising sun painted the room in shades of orange and gold, but the colors held no warmth. He felt drained, empty. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and the shame, a new emotion was stirring, a fragile seedling of understanding. He had a long way to go, a lot to learn. But Chief Langston's unexpected act of grace had given him a chance to confront his own demons and perhaps, finally, to see beyond the limitations of his own perspective. The harsh glare of the studio lights felt alien on his skin. Mark swallowed, the dryness in his throat a constant reminder of the weight pressing down on his chest. The camera lens, a dark, unblinking eye, seemed to bore into him, dissecting his soul. He shifted uncomfortably in the stiff chair, the starched collar of his shirt chafing against his neck. This wasn't the cockpit of a 747. There were no familiar controls, no reassuring hum of engines. Just the oppressive silence of the studio and the ghost of his actions clinging to him like a second skin. He'd rehearsed this countless times, the words a bitter mantra echoing in his mind. Yet now, facing the camera, the carefully constructed script felt flimsy, inadequate. Could 4 minutes truly encapsulate the regret that had consumed him for weeks, the shame that gnawed at his insides? He drew a shaky breath, the metallic tang of fear coating his tongue. This wasn't a flight simulation. This was real. This was his reckoning. He focused on a point just beyond the lens, trying to find a semblance of calm amidst the storm raging within. My name is Mark Ellison, he began, his voice a low rumble, barely audible even to his own ears. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet the camera's gaze. Several weeks ago, at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, I made a terrible mistake. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his transgression. Each syllable was a painful admission, a chipping away at the carefully constructed facade he had presented to the world. The pilot, the captain, the man in control. He wasn't in control then. He'd been a puppet of his own unchecked emotions, a prisoner of his own prejudices. He saw flashes of that day, the crowded terminal, the jostling passengers, the simmering frustration that had been building within him, the memory of the collision, the irrational surge of anger, the stinging slap. He squeezed his eyes shut, the image of Chief Langston's stunned face seared into his mind, the composed dignity she'd maintained in the face of his aggression, the quiet strength that radiated from her even as he'd publicly humiliated her. He'd seen it then, the flicker of disappointment in her eyes, not just for him, but for something far deeper, something he hadn't understood until now. What I did wasn't about security, he continued, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. It was about ego. It was about bias I didn't even realize I had. The confession felt like a physical expulsion, a purging of the toxic thoughts he'd harbored for far too long. He'd spent weeks dissecting his actions, peeling back the layers of justification he'd initially clung to. The delayed flight, the missed connection, the perceived slight. They were all just excuses, flimsy shields against the uncomfortable truth. He'd reacted not as a rational man, but as a man blinded by his own privilege, his own ingrained prejudices. The realization had been a brutal awakening, a shattering of the image he held of himself. I judged Chief Langston before I even knew her name, I saw a black woman and I assumed she was a threat. Saying the words aloud, admitting his prejudice to the world, felt like tearing open a wound. He saw himself reflected in the dark lens of the camera, not the confident pilot he'd always believed himself to be, but a flawed, fallible man. A man who had caused pain, who had abused his position, who had acted out of ignorance and fear. To Chief Langston, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I offer my sincerest, most unreserved apology. I am deeply sorry for the humiliation and distress I caused you. I am sorry for the disrespect I showed you, not only as a woman but as a person of authority. I am sorry for perpetuating the very biases we as a society should be fighting against. He paused, taking a deep breath, the weight of his apology settling heavy in the silence. He knew it wouldn't erase what he'd done. It wouldn't undo the pain he'd caused. But it was a start. First step on the long road to redemption. I have been suspended from my job, and rightly so, he continued, the words devoid of self-pity. The loss of his career, the public shame, the legal repercussions, they were all consequences he deserved to face. But the true consequence, the one that matters most, is the knowledge of the harm I have caused. This incident has forced me to confront my own shortcomings, to examine the biases that I unknowingly carried within me. It has been a painful, but necessary lesson. He looked directly into the camera, his gaze steady, his voice firm. I hope that by speaking out, by acknowledging my mistakes, I can contribute in some small way to a larger conversation. A conversation about implicit bias, about unchecked aggression, about the importance of seeing each other as individuals, not as stereotypes. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be those who would condemn him, who would never forgive him. But he also knew he had to try. He owed it to Chief Langston, he owed it to himself, and he owed it to the society he'd let down. He finished his statement, the silence of the studio pressing in on him once more. The red light on the camera blinked off. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, the tension slowly draining from his body. It was over. Miles away, Chief Monique Langston watched the video on her laptop, the muted glow of the screen illuminating her face. She'd replayed the apology several times, dissecting each word, searching for any hint of insincerity. But there was none. The raw emotion in Mark Ellison's voice, the genuine remorse in his eyes, resonated with a truth that she couldn't deny. She leaned back in her chair, the tension slowly easing from her shoulders. His words wouldn't erase the sting of the slap, the humiliation of the public spectacle. But they offered something more profound, a flicker of hope. A hope that even in the darkest corners of prejudice, a glimmer of understanding could emerge. A hope that even from the ashes of a single act of aggression, the seeds of change could be sown. The faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. It was a start, and sometimes a start was all it took. The muted hum of the air conditioning unit was the only sound in the spacious office. Late afternoon sun, filtered through the blinds, cast long stripes across the polished mahogany desk, illuminating dust motes dancing in the otherwise still air. Monique Langston, Dallas's newly appointed chief of police, sat in her high-backed leather chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her not as the burden of her position, but as the lingering residue of an encounter she couldn't shake. She rotated a heavy, brass paperweight in her hand, its cool smoothness a stark contrast to the burning ember of anger that still flickered within her. Her fingers traced the intricate carvings on the paperweight, a stylized depiction of the Dallas skyline. It had been a gift, a symbol of hope and a reminder of the immense responsibility she carried. But today it felt like a mockery. The shining towers, representative of the city she had sworn to protect, seemed to shimmer with the distorted reflection of the incident at the airport. The airport, the sheer banality of the setting only amplified the absurdity of the encounter. A crowded terminal, the cacophony of announcements and rolling suitcases, the pervasive smell of stale coffee and jet fuel, these were the backdrop to a confrontation that had exposed a raw nerve in society. A nerve she knew was far too easily touched. Mark Ellison. The name echoed in her mind, not with the righteous anger she'd initially felt, but with a chilling sort of disappointment. She remembered the flash of anger in his eyes, the way his face had contorted with rage before his hand made contact with her cheek. The sting had been immediate, sharp, but fleeting. It was the emotional blow that lingered, the visceral reminder of the assumptions that had fueled his actions. He had seen her, a black woman, and in that split second, a narrative had formed in his mind. A narrative of obstruction, of defiance, of what? Inferiority? She closed her eyes, the memory still vivid, the feeling of violation as real as the phantom sting on her cheek. It wasn't the physical pain. She'd faced far worse in her years on the force. It was the casualness of it, the way his anger had escalated so quickly, so effortlessly, as if he had a pre-written script in his head, ready to be enacted at the slightest provocation. She'd seen that script before, played out in different settings with different actors, but always with the same underlying theme. A theme of fear, of prejudice, of the unchecked privilege that allowed a man to strike a woman, a white man to strike a black woman without a second thought. And the initial reactions of the TSA agents, their hesitant steps forward, their eyes darting between her and Ellison, their implicit belief in his version of events that had stung almost as much as the slap itself. But then, she'd shown her badge. The shift in their demeanor had been immediate, almost comical. Their sudden deference, their stammering apologies, the hurried calls for airport police. It was a stark illustration of the power dynamics at play, the way authority could be perceived and how easily it could be manipulated. The airport supervisor, a woman with fiery red hair, had been different. Her concern seemed genuine, her gaze unwavering. She had offered ice for her cheek, a quiet apology for the behavior of her subordinates. It's inexcusable," the supervisor had murmured, her voice laced with shame. "We should have known better. Should have known better." The phrase resonated with Monique now, echoing in the quiet of her office. It wasn't just the TSA agents who should have known better. It was Ellison. It was everyone. We should all know better. The incident had spread like wildfire. News outlets had picked up the story. Social media was abuzz with commentary, and her phone had been ringing incessantly. Messages of support, demands for justice, calls for Ellison's immediate termination. She dealt with the aftermath with a weary sense of familiarity. This was the world she navigated, world where her every action was scrutinized, where her authority was constantly challenged, where the weight of her race and gender were ever present. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of her with her 2 daughters, their faces beaming with uncontainable joy. She looked at their innocent smiles, their eyes full of hope, and felt a pang of guilt. What kind of world was she leaving them? A world where such incidents were still commonplace. "Real change doesn't come from punishment," she murmured to herself, the words echoing the conversation she'd had with her mentor just days before. "It comes from reflection." Her mentor's wise words had seemed abstract then, philosophical musings. Now they held a sharp, poignant relevance. Ellison would face consequences, she knew that. He'd already lost his job, his reputation tarnished, his life irrevocably altered. But true justice wasn't about retribution. It was about understanding, about confronting the biases that lay hidden beneath the surface, the biases that fueled actions and shaped perceptions. She picked up the paperweight again, its weight grounding her in the present. "Ask yourself," her mentor's voice echoed in her mind, "who do you instinctively mistrust and why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It wasn't a question for Ellison alone. It was a question for everyone. A question that demanded an honest, unflinching answer. And in the quiet of her office, Monique Langston began to ask herself that very question. The first step on a long, difficult journey towards understanding and, hopefully, change. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. But in the deepening twilight, a flicker of hope remained.